Courthouses are supposed to be places of calm and dignity, where order is maintained and justice is served. But when stakes and emotions are at their highest, cool heads don't always prevail. Coming up, a mother's anguish at her daughter's sentence. A courtroom showdown between a judge and a spectator.
All right, ma'am, if you want to get smart with me, I'll put you in jail.
And that's when it all goes bad.
And a defendant's threat goes viral.
This gentleman is claimed he has Ebola.
All the jaw-dropping moments. Plus, key insights from our team of crime and legal experts.
There's only one thing you have to keep in mind when you show up in court on any day. Keep your mouth shut.
On Chaos in Court. It's 2017 in Daytona Beach, Florida. An 18-year-old Keandria Cook is about to be sentenced for her role in an attempted carjacking and shooting.
Keandria Cook meets this guy, Perry Nita, on one of those social dating apps, and they agree to meet, to smoke some marijuana, and have some sex.
But Perry doesn't come alone. He brings his friend, Manny Purcell.
Because according to police, Manny is actually the guy that's gonna sell some marijuana to Keandria.
When the two men arrive, Keandria gets in their truck. Within minutes, a masked man with a gun jumps in.
Turns out this masked man is actually Keandria's boyfriend. He's 16-year-old Kendrick Bass, and he's there to rip them off and steal the car.
So this has all been orchestrated well in advance to be a carjacking. Now, what Kendrick and Keandria probably didn't anticipate was Manny starts to fight back.
And ultimately, the gun goes off. Manny is shot.
Keandria and her boyfriend flee, leaving Manny for dead. But Perry rushes him to the hospital, where they are able to save his life.
And you would think that having been involved in such a close call, Kendrick or Keandria would have learned their lesson and decided, whoa, that was too close for comfort. We're probably not gonna do that again. Well, if you were thinking that way, you'd be wrong.
The next day, they do the exact same scam. They use social media to set up a meeting. They have the uninvited man show up. And even though nobody was shot, they did steal a car.
While Kendrick evades capture for 7 months, Keandria is arrested a couple of days later and charged with carjacking with a deadly weapon, attempted carjacking with a deadly weapon, conspiracy, and aggravated battery. Her public defender negotiates a plea deal with the prosecutors to get the conspiracy charge dropped.
In this case, the public defender lets Keandria know that, hey, she doesn't have any priors, and this is her first time in court, so it's gonna be on the low end of the range.
So after discussing this with her mother, they decide that they're gonna take this advice that's been given to them by their public defender.
And shortly before the sentencing, Keandria's mother receives even more confirmation from their attorney.
Obviously, she's not going to prison. She has no prior record. So, I mean, she's looking at probation or community control.
And now she's facing the judge to receive her sentence.
But keep in mind, once you decide to take a plea, there's no guarantees because the sentencing is still in the hands of the judge. And there's always a low end and a high end to what we can do as judges.
Then the sentence is handed down, and it's not probation.
Keeps you guilty of all 3 charges, sentence you to 20 years in state prison.
The mom is hearing this now for the first time. 20 years in prison for your daughter. I mean, the mom, understandably, loses it.
Now, as a mother myself, I could totally understand the gut-wrenching cries that came from this woman's mouth. It was hard to watch. Keandria, after hearing the sentence come down, she kind of appears to be dumbfounded.
She looks at her mom. She's crying now.
The officers who are trained in this immediately just drag her and get her out of the vicinity.
Now, the question is, was 20 years too much? I'm not so sure because this was an aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon to a victim that was set up on the internet. And you have to take into account the fact that the very next day, she committed the same crime with a new victim.
But the family disagrees and wants to withdraw Keandria's initial plea. They claim that if they'd known there was a chance she'd receive 20 years in prison, they'd never have accepted the deal.
It is possible to take back your plea, and different courts in different jurisdictions have different standards for that to happen. In this case, they had to prove a standard of manifest injustice. And that basically means that what Ms. Cook received as a sentence was shocking and unconscionable.
The key to this decision is that voicemail.
Obviously, she's not going to prison. She has no prior record. So, I mean, she's looking at probation or community control.
Whatever happened to, kind of prepare somebody for the worst? I mean, that sets somebody up for disaster.
The judge chalks it up to a miscommunication.
There's no doubt in my mind that Ms. Cook believed she was going home. So the manifest injustice that does exist here is not the sentence itself. It's the fact that you entered a plea, in my opinion, that was not free, knowing, and voluntarily entered.
The motion to revoke her initial plea is granted. Keandria gets a new lawyer who enters a new plea and requests a pre-sentencing investigation report, or PSI. A special investigation that looks into a defendant's background to see if there are any extenuating circumstances that should lighten the sentence.
What's her relationship in the community? How were her grades in school? What does she want to do with her future? All of these things will be presented to the judge in a package so the judge can determine whether or not she deserves a lifetime of prison or a little less.
I don't know if the first public defender that was appointed to her was incompetent or ignorant of the law or protocols, but he didn't provide any of that.
When Keandria enters the courtroom for resentencing, the judge reminds her of the severity of her crime.
Knowing how dangerous and deadly it could be, you did basically the same thing again. That was the difficult part for me. I think you got good in you, and I think you got potential. Don't lose sight of that. I'm going to sentence you to 11 years for state prison.
So, far different outcome, far better result for this defendant, and probably the right outcome.
During the second sentence, 11 years, there was no outburst this time.
Keandria's boyfriend, Kendrick Bass, is also put on trial for the crime and is sentenced to 20 years in prison. Keandria is set to be released in 2028. She will be 29 years old.
Hopefully, Keandria is going to think long and hard over her sentence years to figure out what she did wrong and never do it again.
It's 2019 in the Sherbinsky District Courthouse in Moscow. Leonid Grazer is facing murder charges for killing his 21-year-old sister, Ariada Korol.
Witnesses tell the police that they found Grazer in the apartment with his sister, who had been stabbed multiple times. Blood all over the place, and Grazer allegedly used that blood to write demonic symbols both on his sister's body and on his own head.
And he said that the reason that he killed his sister is because he was trying to free himself from Satan.
Now he's in court, and he's in a glass box. The glass box is used in Russian courts to hold some of the defendants who are on trial. Now, there's some controversy surrounding that because think about it, even in Russia, there is a presumption of innocence. However, that glass box already gives an impression that you are dangerous and that somehow you need to be contained.
As Grazer awaits the judge, he is about to prove why he needs to be contained.
Grazer is looking around from his glass imprisonment like he's going to find a way out. But talking is not what this guy really wants at this time. He wants out. So he goes up.
At this point, the officers realize, okay, we have a situation on our hands.
You see this chaos break out in the courtroom as the officers are scrambling around trying to find the most effective way to gain control of him.
They start hitting him with batons. Ceiling tiles are flying everywhere.
And he's kicking, they're pulling his pants off, but they don't let go of his foot.
One of the female officers goes around and presses a panic alarm. And what that does is it tells the rest of the command that you have a situation in a certain room.
And so one of the other officers who's now on scene gets a taser.
There aren't too many people who can just withstand or shake off the pain that a taser can inflict on someone.
In fact, at some point, he's asking for help. Hey, give me your hand, give me your hand.
Eventually, he's contained back in this box.
So at the end, the police look, and all of a sudden they realize they are on camera. Now, they're probably thinking, uh-oh, we're in trouble now. But in reality, they did what they were supposed to do.
Grazer eventually faces a judge, and in September of 2020, he's sentenced to compulsory psychiatric medical treatment. It's unknown whether any changes will be made to security in the Sherbinsky courthouse.
I think these Russian bailiffs are probably not used to this kind of escape attempt, because that's the theory behind the glass box. It keeps the defendant in place. In the U.S., we are more used to defendants who try to exercise their freedom before they should.
In Jefferson County, Kentucky, Judge Katie King is handling her normal daily docket of cases.
She's standing because she was in a recent car accident, and it just is better for her back and neck to stand. So as she's doing her thing, she notices a couple of female in the back of the courtroom, and they just seem to be chatting, inappropriately talking while the process of justice is going forward.
And Katie King does not appreciate the disruption.
All right, ladies, if y'all want to step outside, please, for me, thank you.
This is very common in courtrooms. When you see someone disrespecting the court, the first thing you do is you tell them to stop. And if they don't stop, you demand that they leave your courtroom.
I need you all both to step outside now, please. Thank you. Both you all need to step outside, please.
And at some point, we see one of the women stand up and kind of sullenly meander, kind of at her own pace, out of the courtroom.
She then stops in the doorway and starts to come back in.
At that point, the judge says, okay, hold it.
Ma'am, I asked you to step outside. You know what? Come in here right now.
Judge King says, bring the young lady up to the podium, because now it's time to face the judge.
The young lady is 24-year-old Sapphire Doss. She's in court today to support a friend who is on the judge's docket.
I want you to have a seat over there. I asked you 10 times, then you turn around and you start to come back in here. I'm not going to argue with you. Okay, don't.
Doss says, then don't. Probably not the best thing to say to the judge. You might call it disrespectful.
And that's when it all goes bad.
All right, ma'am, if you want to get smart with me, I'll put you in jail.
I'm not getting smart with you.
Yes, you are. You said, okay, don't.
Don't disrespect me. I'm not disrespecting.
You know what, ma'am? Come up here right now.
This is not the Doss courtroom. This is the judge's courtroom. And as soon as she gets back and forth with the judge on this whole disrespect thing, she's in trouble.
Not only could you be held in contempt of court, but your whole life can be inconvenienced just because you won't respect authority. And in this case, Judge King is going to make sure Ms. Doss understands that principle.
You know what? I'm holding you in contempt, okay? You just asked me not to disrespect you. Yeah, well, you've been disrespecting me because I asked you to do one thing and you didn't do it.
He had my money. I was asking him for my money. Okay, I'm hungry.
Okay, here's the problem, is you sat there and I said you all need to step outside. And you just sat there. I said you all need to step outside. You just sat there. All I did was ask you to step outside because you guys were laughing and giggling back there.
If the judge asks you leave, you leave. It's that simple, and you don't come back in unless you're asked back in.
Do you go to church?
Yes, I do.
Do you act like that in church?
No, I don't.
Okay. Is there any reason you would change your behavior here as opposed to church?
Something was funny.
I understand that. I can appreciate that. I I understand you decided to laugh, but would you do that in church?
If something was funny.
The comparison to a church or workplace is the acknowledgement that when you walk into certain situations, there are people who have authority and control, and you have to acknowledge that and adhere to that.
But what's so funny about sitting here? You're not supposed to be talking anyway, so what's so funny?
Oh,
Court's not
she
supposed to
made
be
a
funny.
comment and we. And
Well, you all
laughed.
shouldn't have been talking.
Okay.
I don't understand.
She was talking and I
Well,
thought
you're
it was
talking
funny,
over
so
me right now. I
laughed.
don't understand what your problem is.
I don't have a problem. You
Yes, you
asked
do.
me a question,
You
so
do
I'm
have a
answering
problem.
it.
There's a level of expectation, and anyone who's been in court, whether it's your first time or your 50th time, should understand that there's a certain amount of decorum that's expected.
You're going to jail for 5 days, all right? I'm holding her in contempt 5 days.
Ultimately, Judge King finds Ms. Doss in contempt and sentences her to 5 days in jail. This is not what Ms. Doss expected when she came to court that day.
Now, some people may say that the judges are using their power to just deal with people who are annoying, and that may be true. But she had every right to control her courtroom. I've done it, and other judges have done it also.
Miss Doss is escorted out of the courtroom.
Is she going crazy back there?
Doss's uncompliant behavior doesn't stop when she's ushered out of the courtroom. You can hear her screaming at the deputies on the other side of the hallway from outside of the courtroom, telling them not to touch her. Do not touch me. Do not touch me.
Judge,
Yes.
you won't give me no info on her.
Okay.
We just gonna send her on up.
Tell her she needs to, if she wants to continue yelling back there, then her numbers are just going to go up.
Miss Doss is not cooperating with officers. The officers come back and end up telling the judge she's not giving us her name, she's not giving us her phone number, she's just not listening at all. She's dancing to her own drum.
Tell her she needs to remain calm, quiet, and cooperative, or else I'm going to keep adding more days.
Sapphire Doss is booked and heads off to serve her 5 days in jail.
There's only one thing you have to keep in mind when you show up in court on any day. Keep your mouth shut. Speak when spoken to. That's it. You'll be fine.
2 days later, Sapphire Doss once again finds herself in front of Judge King. She pleads guilty to the contempt charges and is released with time served.
All she had to do was walk out the door.
It's 2014 in Fort Lauderdale, and Circuit Court Judge John Hurley is conducting bond hearings.
A bond hearing is set so that the judge can determine what it will cost for a defendant to leave court or to leave jail.
It is as straightforward as it gets. Maybe not so much today.
Waiting his turn is 42-year-old Joseph Britton, in court accused of battery and disorderly conduct charges.
It all started when Joseph Britton was outside of a bar smoking a cigarette.
So problem is, he was within close proximity to some fuel tanks with this lit cigarette. Bar manager comes out and says, hey, listen, I need you to move. You can't be smoking a cigarette near these fuel tanks.
Joseph's response is to become belligerent. He's super drunk, and he starts to create this public intoxication, disorderly conduct type of situation.
Before the hearing, Judge Hurley reads details from the arrest report.
You see Judge Hurley stop for a second and get this serious look on his face as he looks up and he calls out for Joseph Britton to approach.
President Domain, Your Honor. Mr. Miller, I back up, and I back up pretty quick if I were you.
You can see the confusion on the attorney's face as he thinks to himself, why? What did I do? Am I standing too close? What's going on?
And the judge, you can tell, is a little confused too.
I don't know. What do we do?
The judge then asks the deputy to step toward the defendant, to come to the podium.
May I see one of the deputies? Mr. Britton, take a step to your right. Deputy,
Yes, Your Honor.
this gentleman has claimed he has Ebola.
Yeah, Ebola. That's a concern. In fact, the deputy summarizes it very concisely.
In 2014, the deadly Ebola virus spreading through Africa was creating panic in the U.S. thanks to high rates of contagion.
Ebola, similar to COVID-19, is a high alert, high anxiety situation. People were dying dramatically from Ebola.
I believe you should clear the courtroom of all the prisoners. Can you send them out in the hallway?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
If this was my courtroom, I would have done the exact same thing. Made sure that everyone had a distance from the defendant and that we exited the courtroom as fast as possible.
Hey, get up. You're just making it worse for everybody, man, right now, man.
The prisoner's reaction is funny. They're not panicking. They're just pissed off that they're not going to get their day in court. So they probably thought he was BSing.
And it turns out he was BSing. When the hearing began, Judge Hurley was simply reading the arrest warrant. For some reason, Britton told the arresting officer he had Ebola.
You know, it's not uncommon for a suspect to say something stupid in the midst of an arrest. I don't know if they think it's going to prevent them from going to jail or whatever.
So the arresting officer makes a note in his report about this claim of Ebola. And that is the report the judge is looking at when he calls the defendant's case. Well, in between that report and the appearance by the defendant, they had cleared this defendant. He did not have Ebola. So even though it was perfectly safe and this defendant was a threat to nobody, the judge didn't know that.
As a result of Joseph's shenanigans, the jail's put on lockdown, shut down for 4 hours. Hazmat has to come in and do some major cleaning and disinfecting of the area, all for a guy who did not have Ebola.
After 4 hours, the jail is reopened and the bond hearings continue. Britton receives no new charges for the fiasco.
One would think that Britton might get in some additional trouble, but it had already been resolved, worked out, and determined that he was just being a knucklehead. The officers had cleared him. Medical personnel had cleared him.
And therefore, the problem lay in the miscommunication to the court. Britton ultimately receives 1 year and a day for his initial crimes.
My hope would be that he would never do that again, but more importantly, my hope would be that he would never engage in the kind of activity that caused him to be in this predicament in the first place.
This gentleman claimed he has Ebola.